So hello everybody again, welcome to the ninth ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The Six Mass Extinction, the Environmental Crisis and the Future of Humanity. Our speaker is Professor Gerardo Ceballos from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and senior researcher at the Breakthrough Institute. Gerardo is an ecologist and conservationist, very well known for his theoretical and empirical work on animal ecology and conservation, on global distribution patterns of diversity, endemism, and extinction risk in vertebrates. He's also well known for his contribution to understanding the magnitude and impact of the six mass extinction. Gerardo has received several awards in his scientific career. He's a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Association of Arts and Sciences. He has published more than 500 scientific and popular articles and 55 books. His publication counts over 26,000 citations. Today, Gerardo will tell us about the ongoing six mass extinction. A mass extinction is an episode where many species become extinct in a short time. All previous mass extinctions stemmed from natural catastrophes, such as volcanic eruptions, depletion of oxygen in the oceans, and meteorite impact. The ongoing six mass extinction is different, as it is caused by human activity. Current figures show that 477 species have become extinct in the last 100 years. Under a natural extinction rate, we would have expected to have only 9 extinctions. At this pace, we may lose a large proportion of vertebrates, including mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes in the next 2 to 3 decades. Those species are essential to maintain ecosystem services, such as combination of the atmosphere's gases, the quality and quantity of water, soil fertilization, pollination. By losing species, we are eroding the conditions of Earth that are essential for human well-being. Habitat loss due to agriculture, forestry, mining, urbanization, overfishing, and overhunting, pollution, greenhouse gas emission, and human overpopulation are the leading causes of the ongoing mass extinction. We still have time to avoid the most tragic consequences of the six mass extinction, but action is needed. We should understand that saving endangered animals is the only way humanity has to save itself. Gerardo, many thanks again for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to talk about the six mass extinction, conservation, and the future of humanity. I'd like to thank Claudio Morana for his kind invitation to this seminar. Well, basically, it's important for us who are scientists in the biodiversity and conservation to recognize recently in December, Tom Lovejoy and Emma Wilson passed away and leaving a big gap on the people who's working on these issues. Many years ago, Aldo Leopold said that we live in a world of wounds, and if you look around, this is exactly what happened. You look around and you see a forest with parts of it being destroyed by crops, you see cars, you see highways, cities, towns, etc. So the whole planet is now dominated by human activities. What I do in my work, I work at the National University of Mexico, and basically I do, what we do is basic research, and then we work and apply that research in conservation of endangered species, the establishment and management of protected areas, conservation public policy, and outreach. And one thing is very important to mention is that in my lab, we have been able to combine from very basic things like research to apply it to solve some of the largest problems, both in Mexico and in the world. And today, I'm talking about extinction, but it is important to understand that in this, to understand the gravity and the magnitude of the extinction, the current extinction crisis, we need to understand that we only know around 2% of all the plants and animals, wild plants and animals on this planet. This is, for instance, in this graph, you can see all animals that all these animals who has been discovered in the last 10, 15 years in this planet. And just to give you an idea, more than 80 species of monkeys has been described in 2000. The conservative estimates indicate that there are maybe around 50 million species of animals. The top estimates is 100 million or more. So most of the biodiversity of this planet is unknown to scientists, and therefore, when the species disappear, most of them we don't even know what are their scientific names. And most of the known and unknown species are found both in the tropics and the sea. And just to give you an idea, this is the photograph of a species, all of them new to science, found in a single exploration trip down to around 3,000 meters in the Pacific Ocean. And in this particular one, they discovered the largest animal on the planet, a 47-meter long worm. So the planet is full of these incredible manifestations of life, and these incredible plants and animals, most of them are unknown to us. And unfortunately, I mean, these animals and this plant that have evolved, that we have evolved with this amazing richness of species since our first ancestors stepped 3 million years ago in the planet. And we're losing them. Right now, it is very important to emphasize that we have a fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is an unprecedented loss of biodiversity. And by saying the loss of biodiversity, basically we're talking about population and species of plant, animal, and microorganisms. And those plants and animals and organisms are integrated in biological systems that we call them ecosystems. And those ecosystems are fundamental for having life on Earth. Let's remember that Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, once said that there are more planets, galaxies, and celestial bodies on the universe than grains of sand on the planet. Just imagine that. So basically, in this immense universe, there is life only on this planet, and there is life only on this planet because the conjunction, the work of all these animals and plants together create the possibilities of having life on the Earth, and we're losing them at an unprecedented rate. So, what is the current situation? When I was studying my PhD 30 years ago, there was basically only one big global environmental problem. That was the loss of the ozone layer. But now there is all the time in the scientific literature, there is more and more new problems, environmental problems, global environmental problems. And if we are basically reductionists and we like to see what are the causes, the root causes of these problems, basically we can mention about three things. One is the human population growth. Second, consumption and inequity. And third, technological efficiency. I will go back to them in a minute. So these factors, human population growth, consumption, and technological inefficiency, are basically causing problems like global climate disruption, habitat loss, overexploitation, emerging diseases, invasive species, toxification, pollution. And all of this is causing the sixth mass extinction and the loss of ecosystem services and goods. So we published a paper at the beginning of 2021, and where a group of my colleagues and friends, we decided to try to see what were the specific losses of environmental, how was the loss of specific indicators of the well-being, of the health of the environment. We were expecting to find out a bad situation, but we were really shocked. We were not really prepared to see how bad are all these indicators of how much impact we have created on the planet. The paper, we call it Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future. And we decided to put the title after we got the data. And if you can see very quickly, the red are basically factors like the Earth's surface that has been affected, or the oceans, or the kelp forests, and so on. And you can see most of them we have lost 50 or more of the that important characteristics. In other words, we're losing. We have lost 50% or more of the flowing waters, of wetland areas, of the terrestrial vegetation, of the black coral reefs, and so on. So this is what it's telling us, basically, is that the root causes of the environmental impact are right now massive, and the magnitude is basically global, and it is really, really big. So focusing on the extinct species, and then I'll talk about populations. Basically, a few years ago, we were thinking, if we have lost around 1,000 species of vertebrates in the last 500 years, it is bad, it is really bad, or this is like a normal, this is like what happened in the previous million years. Because let's remember that evolution works as the balance of two processes, extinction and speciation. Extinction of a species and speciation is the generation of new species by evolutionary processes. So, so we decided to look at basically what has happened. And we were lucky enough that in 2011, a colleague of us from Berkeley University published this paper where he has been able to, with his colleagues, to evaluate what was the extinction rate, the normal or background extinction rate, as we call it, in the last few million years. So having an extinction rate for mammals could allow us to apply that extinction rate to the current extinction crisis to see if the species that we're losing is basically the same number of species that we have lost in the last few million years, and if not, if we are an accelerated extinction crisis that should ring the bell for its impact. So basically, first of all, what we have seen is like there has been many species becoming extinct in the last decades, and recently the U.S. declares 20 bird, fish, and other species extinct, like the ivory-billed woodpecker here, one of the largest woodpeckers in the world. And so basically, what we did in 2015 is like evaluate with the extinction rates on the past what was happening in the what is happening now, and we basically really managed to conclude that we have entered the sixth mass extinction. And let me tell you that what is a mass extinction. We scientists have coined this term of mass extinction, and for 5 episodes of really high extinction rates in the last 550 million years. Here we have the numbers of extinctions, and here are the million years. And what we can see in this graph is basically 3 things. On the one hand, this is the number of species. We can see that throughout the last 550 million years, there has been an increment on the diversity of life. So basically, right now, we are in the time, in these 550 million years, and basically in the history of life on Earth, the 3.7 billion years of life on Earth, this is the time where we have more species present at a single time. So this is the pinnacle of biodiversity. We're living in an area that we have more species of plants and animals and microorganisms in the wild. This is the first thing. The second thing is like we have seen this progression, you know, and there are 5 episodes where the extinction rate has been incredibly big, and so there hasn't been a progression, but there was a decrease on the number of species. And we call this mass extinction. And this mass extinction has 3 characteristics. On the one hand, they were caused by a natural catastrophe, like the impact of a meteorite on the planet 66 million years ago that evaporate dinosaurs and around 70 to 80% of all plants and animals. And these 5 ones, so the one is they were catastrophic. The second thing is because of the extinction, 70% or more of all the wild plants and animals become extinct. And third, this was, in geological terms, really fast, hundreds of thousands or a few million years. And then the last thing that we can see is after the massive extinction, there has been a recovery of life that usually between 10, 15 million years afterwards. So fortunately for life on Earth, after this massive catastrophes of the mass extinction, there has been a recovery of the biodiversity, and that recovery has taken a few million years. And it is important to also understand that after losing all these species, all the species that become extinct will never see them again. So if really we look at all the environmental problems, extinction is the only one that is irreversible. And it's irreversible because once you lose a species, there will never be something like that. In other words, climate change, pollution, and so on, with the passing a few hundred thousands of a few thousand years, the life will recover, unless there is a nuclear holocaust that destroys everything. So we published, so we were able to look at the extinction rates, the current extinction rates, and we published this paper in Science Advances. It's called Accelerated Modern Human-Induced Species Losses Entering the Sixth Mass Extinction. And basically what we find here is that the number of species that has become extinct in the last 500 years, but mostly specifically in the last 100 years, are much, much higher than the background extinction rate. And we can see here is the cumulative number of species extinctions according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And we have here the time interval. If you see here the dotted line, this is the background rate. If the extinctions happening now were at the same rate that the last previous million years, the lines should be down here. But unfortunately, what you can see here is that the lines are much higher, so indicating that the current extinction rates for vertebrates are much, much higher than the ones in the previous year. And this is an indication that we have entered the sixth mass extinction. And then here in this graph, we see that it's basically, there is a perfect relation between the number of species extinction and the population, the human population. Basically, there is a close a mirror image of the more extinction we have, the more population, human population we have. So basically, what we found is, in a nutshell, the species that we lost in 100 years should have been lost in 10,000 years in normal times. So we lost in 100 years what we have lost in the previous million years in 10,000 years. So that was the massive magnitude. And when we publish our paper, people say, or the science say, oh, that's fine, but this only apply to vertebrates. Unfortunately, after we published the paper and many people start to look at the extinction rates in other groups, in vertebrates, plants, and even in microbes, in some microbes, they discover that species are being lost right now in different groups of plants and animals in the planet 100 times to 100 to 1,000 times faster than in the previous million years. So 1,000 times faster means that the species that were lost in 100 years would have been lost in 100,000 years. So that's the magnitude. So we can really firmly say that the new paradigm in terms of extinction is that they are not normal, that we have entered a massive extinction process that is beginning, and if continues like that, we will lose most of the biodiversity in this planet in the next 100 years, most likely in the next 20 to 30 years. And what is important to understand here also is that in geological terms, this is an instantaneous, because it's happening in a few decades, while the other extinctions happen in hundreds of thousands or millions of years. So when we publish this paper, we decide that we also look and start to think that focusing on a species extinction is not enough, because basically when you lose a species, you have lost previously all its populations. Let's say, for instance, if we have jaguars in Mexico and they become extinct in Mexico, there are still populations in other places in Latin America. But once you lose the jaguars in Mexico and in Central America and South America, then the species will become extinct, will be called extinct. But in the process, you are losing so many species, so many populations, and that was very important to understand, and I will explain why. So we analyze in this particular paper something like 27,000 species of vertebrates, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fishes, and see their population trends. And those 27,000 species include some that are incredibly common, really common species, relatively common, rare, very rare, and critically endangered. And we find out that 32% of all the species of vertebrates are losing populations. And are losing population for two reasons. Either they are losing the range, they're contracting the ranges, or they are losing the numbers, or both. And this is an example of what we mean that. This is the distribution of lions in around 1300. They were all over here, and now this is the current distribution. And when we did this graph, something like 10 years ago, there were 34,000 lions remaining. Now there are only around 22,000. We lost 12,000, almost 1/3 of the population in only 10 years. So this is what we call the population extinction. So it is important then to recognize that the current extinction crisis involves the species on the one hand and the populations that made up those species. What are the drivers? Well, as I said, the population growth, consumption, and technology. And this is just a graph of the human population. And in biology, we know that population that grows exponentially like this has only two possible outcomes. One is it could stabilize, and the second, it will collapse because energy is finite. So basically, what we are looking here is that the human population will either collapse if we don't stabilize it in the near future. And basically, this population, growing population, requires more food, requires more space for food, for infrastructure, for housing, and so on. And it produces more waste, it consumes more, and so on. And then the technology that we're using, like carbon and fossil and oil, are basically very inefficient. So consumption and efficient technologies and population growth is what is putting this planet to the brink of collapse. And this is basically because, as we were saying, everything is focused on creating more wealth for few individuals and for few countries, and that is unsustainable. What we should strive for is that the society should strive for having a society that is more just, socially speaking, and more sustainable, environmentally speaking. So in terms of the species that we're losing, wildlife trade, habitat loss, and climate change are the most important root causes responsible for the brunt of the problem. Whereas climate change hasn't really unleashed its full impacts. But once we have the full impact of climate change, then we will probably see a much higher extinction rates. So what are the drivers? What habitat loss and fragmentation? Here you see crops, the remaining forests surrounded by crops. And what we can see in this map is areas where most of them are under agriculture. And as you can see, this is outside them, there are areas on cattle grazing, and there are many other areas like here where you cannot have either cattle or agriculture because they are either too cold or too hot. So basically we're reaching the limits, the physical limits of having more land for crops or for cattle. And then the other thing is overexploitation. There are only 2% of the large fishes found in the oceans in the 1960s are still alive, and we're talking about tuna fish, swordfish, sharks. in terms of the illegal trade, for instance, pangolins, these mammals that are incredibly beautiful because they have the body covered by scales. And these are one of the most illegally traded animals. There are 23,000 pangolins here on this photograph. No, 3,000 pangolins in this photograph, sorry. And I have been in Africa and in Asia in places where there are supposed to be pangolins many, many times looking for them. And I have seen only one time a pangolin. So where do you get 3,000 or 20,000 of 18,000 pangolins in the illegal trade? So the estimate is that more 1 million pangolins have been destroyed in the last 5 years. And in terms of the elephant, there will be no elephant in the wild in 2032, 33, 35, if we continue the extermination. Yeah, there are an elephant is still illegally killed every 30 minutes. A few days ago, I saw the first one of my colleagues put some camera traps in the Congo, in some of the areas where the last forest elephants are in Africa. And it's incredibly horrifying to see that the cameras show how a column of more than 100 people pass in front of the camera carrying ivory from tusk from the illegally killed African elephants. They have killed more than 200,000 African elephants in the last 15 years. So finally, climate destruction. And this is important to emphasize that like the extinction rate, the same thing with the global climate destruction, is people, there was a big propaganda to try to deny that climate change, climate disruption is human cause. And we hear a graph, just what is happening in the last years, in the last few decades. And the good news is that if it's human cause, it can be solved if we understand what are the causes. Exactly the same thing for extinction. If we know what are the causes of extinction and it is human induced, then we can identify what are those causes and we can do something. If there were natural catastrophes like climate change will be natural, there will be nothing we could do and we will be doomed. Fortunately, we can do something. Unfortunately, we are not doing enough to stop these problems. And so, just to give you more statistics on the impact of our activities on this planet, around 40% of all the terrestrial species has declined by all terrestrial species has declined by 39% between 1970 and 2010, and 70% of all the individual animals has been lost since 1980. And the same here, you can see what happened with the freshwater species and the marine species. So it's a big, big blow on what we are doing, our activities is doing. It's a massive impact on wild plants and animals. And I want you to concentrate, first of all, on the one on the left. Here we see the biomass distribution of the land mammals on Earth, and we will see that farmland animals account for 60% here. Humans, 8 billion humans, account for 36%, and wild animals, all wild animals account the biomass only for 4%. And if we go to here to the right, we see that in terms of the birds, it illustrated even worse. 70% of all the birds are chicken and other poultry, 70%. And 30% of the biomass is made up by the 11,000 wild birds in this planet. So clearly, you know, we have taken most of the energy available for wild plants and animals and converted either to farm animals or human biomass. So what we have left to the wild creatures is very little space and very little energy. So, well, you may ask, why does it matter? It's kind of sad, kind of tragic that we're losing this species, but This is the price of development. This is the price of producing wealth. This is the pride of having driving human society. But that's not the case. I mean, there are many reasons we should care about the extinction crisis. In terms of moral, there are moral, ethical, cultural, historic, evolutionary, and so on reasons to prevent it. But perhaps the most important one is that all these plants and animals, provide what we scientists call environmental goods and services. And environmental services, are basically all these benefits that we humans get from free for the proper function of nature. And those are basically things like clean water. All the clean water that we have is because of the well functioning of nature. And the proper gases of the combination of the proper gases of the atmosphere that makes life possible on Earth and not in any other place in the universe, as far as we know, is because of the plants and animals. And there are all the energy that we have that is not fossil energy comes from plants that is then transfer the energy of the sun and with water into energy that we use for other plants, animals, and microorganisms. All these plants and wild plants and animals also protect us against diseases. And many of these plants and animals have diseases that hasn't affected humans. And the last COVID epidemic is by now clearly being confirmed that arises from wild animals in the illegal trade. And what you can see here in this photograph, this is one of the markets where in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, Vietnam, and China, you can see here how do they sell the animals. There are dogs, there are wild animals, and one top to the other, they pee, they defecate on one to the other. The conditions are really bad for sanitary conditions, and you see this person eating his food. So a virus like COVID jumping from one wild species to a domestic species or to a person is really easy. And this has happened with COVID more than 40 times in the last 40 years. There has been many diseases for 40, 50 years, like AIDS, Ebola, Marburg fever, Lassa fever, hantavirus. All of those viral diseases have jumped from wild animals in the illegal trade to humans. And you can see here what they call the wet markets. If you go to Google and put wet market, you will see these horrific places where they steal all these animals. Most of them illegally trade from places in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The consumption of wild species is unthinkable. The magnitude, for instance, in China alone, over 100 million of individuals of wild animals, most of them from the illegal trade, are used every year. It generates $7 billion in profit and employs 14 million people. That's the scale and the magnitude. And the illegal trade is more profitable, was profitable as the drug trade or the arms trade or the human trade without the legal implications. So when we talk about these environmental services, let me give you another example. And here is a mangrove. The mangroves, provide us with many important benefits. I mean, like in Mexico, around 95% of all the species that are important in fisheries, economically important for the fisheries in the country, are nursed here in the mangroves. But then we destroy the mangroves and put houses, put shrimp farms and crops. And then we are very surprised when we have a hurricane or a tropical storm and we lose these areas with massive impacts, negative impacts. Because we have mangroves also. Just imagine that we have the mangrove here, and then the hurricane came with this massive force of water and wind, and it faces the mangrove, so the mangrove reduces the force, so it doesn't harm so much humans. So just before I go to this, another two examples. 70% of all the crops that we use presently are pollinated, totally or partially by wild animals like bees, like bats, like birds, butterflies. And around the same 75% of all the active compounds of medicines, of drugs that we use now are come from wild plants and animals. So by destroying all these species, we're basically destroying the capability of the planet to maintain life. And paradoxically, by killing all these species, we are reducing the capabilities of the planet to maintain life in general, but also to maintain human life in particular. And I used to say, basically say like an analogy is like this wall that I have behind me is made of bricks. If I take one brick, the wall doesn't collapse, but it starts to work less properly. More noise, more dust, more humidity. If I take many bricks, it will really weaken. Eventually, I will take one brick and it will collapse. And the presence of the COVID pandemic is one sign of the collapse of the environment. And when people say that collapse is a very strong word, I would say, if you ask one of the 2 billion people that have drinking water right now, they're in collapse. They are in a collapse environment. If you ask the 2.5 billion people don't have enough food to eat today, they don't have. They are already in a collapsing environment. If you ask the 150 million environmental refugees that are on the planet, they are already facing collapse. So, what we can do, what we should do, well, the one thing we need to do is to become actors and not spectators. We really have to understand that in terms of the extinction crisis and the global warming, we don't have a century, we don't have 50 years, we don't have 40 years. What is happening in the next 20 years is what will define how many species are going to be survived in this planet, and what will be the fate of humanity. It is very likely, if we continue on this trajectory, there will be a collapse of civilization in the next 30, 35, 40 years, or even probably faster. And so it is very important that we become engaged in our different disciplines. And at the end, I think it's incredibly simple. The goals of humanity should be incredibly simple: to be socially more just and environmentally more sustainable. Clearly, on the other hand, that is the complexity of the social, political, and economic complexity that we live today, and it makes sometimes really difficult to achieve this. The good news is that we still have time to avoid this massive collapse because of the species, the biological species extinction crisis and the global warming, but the window of opportunity is closing, is rapidly closing. Thank you very much.